Hey everyone, Singleton Sean here, and today in Simple Trader I want to clean up the way that we report error messages and status messages. So as you can see right now, all that we do is just pop up these message boxes for success and for errors throughout our application. And in my opinion, this isn't really the best way to report messages to the user. Like, yeah, it works, but the pop-up, it's kind of dirty. It's not the most pleasant thing to do. What I would really want to do is integrate these messages with the UI. So for example, come into our buy view right here. I really want to have a text block right here that shows the error message. So let's say this would have text that would bind to an error message. And of course this is an error, so we're going to set the foreground as dark red. And we'll just leave that for now, but we're going to have to play around with this a little bit more. But this is really what I want. I want to actually display the error message. So of course, we set up this binding to this error message, and we're going to have to get that from our view model. So if we go to our view model, the by view model, what I'm going to do is put a property down here for the error message. So it's just going to be a string. We'll call it error message. And there we go. We can now set this error message from outside the view model. So if we go back to our by stock command, we could catch an exception for an error, and we could take our by view model and set the error message to basically anything we want. And again, in this case, we'll just set it to the exception message, but we'll clean that up a little bit. And now we're not popping this message box. So that's the goal. That's what I want to do throughout the application. So let's test this out. And while I'm here, I actually want to move this to its own row. So let's go ahead and add that. This will be row 2 now. And let's type in a stock, and let's try and get an exception here and see that error message. So let's buy 500 shares. We should get insufficient funds, and there we go. There is our text in this text block with our error. So of course this isn't very pretty. We're going to clean this up because we want an actual exception. We don't want this. The user doesn't want to know this. They want to know the specific reason that there was a failure. But anyways, let's clean up this UI a little bit. So first off, we need to horizontally align this so it's centered. And let's give it some margin too. We'll give it 10 on the top. And another issue we have is that I want this text block to only be visible if there actually is an error message. So what I want to do is bind the visibility. So we have some options here, but we're going to calculate this visibility from a property on our view model. So let's go back to our view model. Let's actually close this out. And we're going to have a property, it's going to be a boolean, and it's going to tell us if the view model actually has an error message. And if this is true, then we're actually going to show this text block. If it's false, we're going to hide it. And it's just going to be a calculated property, and it's going to use this error message, and it's going to check if the error message is null or empty. And if it is not null or empty, then that means we do have an error message. So now we have this property, but one more thing before we move on here, we need to actually raise onPropertyChanged for this has error message property whenever our error message changes, because this property depends on our error message. So we need to let our UI know that this has a new value when we get a new error message. So now back in our by view, we need to set up this binding. We're going to bind to has error message. But we do have a problem here, and that is has error message is a boolean, true or false. But visibility, that could be either collapsed, hidden, or visible. So we need to use a converter here. Now luckily, with WPF, there is a built-in converter for converting a boolean to a visibility. So let's go ahead and use that. Boolean to visibility converter. We'll give it a key of just boolean to visibility converter. And then we can use that down here, static resource reference. And then if has error message is true, this will be visible. If it's false, this will actually be collapsed. So it's not even going to take up any room in our UI. So let me go ahead and format this. I've been using this format XAML, cleans things up very nicely. Now back in our by stock command, we also have a status message that we have to account for. So that means what I want to do is I want to have by view model, and I want to be able to set a status message to say success, like that. So no message box. So you might be thinking, alright, perfect. We're just going to copy all of this, but I actually don't want to copy this. What I'm going to do instead is create a new view model, and this is going to be called a message view model. And now that I have this message view model, let's actually set this up. Just going to be a regular view model base. We can move these properties into this message view model. And let's actually give these a more generic name. So not error message, just regular message. Clean that up for the field as well. And then instead of has error message, just has message. Because we're going to be using this view model for status messages and error messages. So now back in here, let's use that view model. So we're going to have a property for a message view model, and we'll call this the error message view model, and we'll just instantiate it in our constructor. There we go. And now same thing, but we're going to have a status message view model. So let's instantiate one of those as well. And there we go. That's great. Now back in our by view, we need to update this because we don't have these bindings anymore. This is message and has message, but these properties aren't on the by view model. They're on the error message view model. So we need to set the data context of this text block to an error message view model. And that's going to point to this property right here. And then all of these bindings are going to be resolved from the actual message view model. So that's great. Let's format this. And now I'm going to copy this and do another one for the status message view model. Like that. And this one's going to have dark green instead for the text because it's like a happy message. And let's put this in its own row. You could keep these in the same row, but I do fear there is a possibility, I guess, you could have a status message and an error message. So we're going to split them up. Let's create a new row for that. And there we go. That should be everything we need. Now there is an issue back in our byStock command. We can't just set the status message or set the error message because now we only expose the error message view model, and we would have to go through that to set the error message, or just set the message in this case. But I don't want to do that. I don't really want this command to have to like nest through all these properties. I just want to actually expose the error message and be able to set it like this. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to expose a property for error message, and it's actually going to be a set only property, and we're going to set the error message view model error message, or just message, to the value that gets passed into the setter. So now back on our byStock command, as you can see, we can now just call byViewModel.errorMessage and set it to whatever we want. Now that's great. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for our status message. And we're going to use the status message view model this time. And now, we can actually close out of this. We're done here. We can go back to our byStock command, and there we go. We're setting the status message. Now let's clean up these messages a little bit. So instead of actually using the exception message, all I really want to say is transaction failed. So just a basic message. And then for the status message, what I'm going to do is actually, before we get into this, I'm going to move these variables, so the buy view model symbol and the shares to buy. I'm going to move those into local variables right here, so symbol. And the reason I'm moving these in the variables is because I want to reuse them in my status message. So I'm just kind of cleaning it up a little bit so it's easier to read. And then we're going to have an int for the shares. And now that I have these in variables, we can update the status message. So I'm going to use string interpolation so that I can just use these variables in the string. So we're going to say successfully purchased, and then use the variable shares. So successfully purchased some number of shares of a symbol. And there we go. There is our messages. Now, that's great, but we could do better for this error message, because this byStock method, it could throw an insufficient funds exception. So we could catch this specific exception and then tell our user, hey, you don't have enough money. Now, what else could it throw? this get price, that could throw an invalid symbol exception. So really, we should document all these exceptions, and then we would be able to see those exceptions that this buy stock method could throw right here, and then specifically catch them and give better error messages. So let's go ahead and do that. And for the documentation, we're actually going to document on the interfaces because we use those interfaces. If we put the documentation on like these specific implementations, we're not going to be able to see them on the interface if we use those. So we're going to put those on the interface. So let's do some XML documentation. But what's really important is what we do next. So we're going to document the exceptions that this could throw. So it could throw an invalid symbol exception. And to get some IntelliSense on this, we can actually use Simple Trader domain exceptions like that. And there we go. Now we actually see the exception. And this gets thrown if the symbol does not exist. Now back on our stock price service, we could also get some generic kind of HTTP client exceptions, and we don't throw those specifically. We don't really know what those are, but we can just say those are just regular exceptions. So we can document this will just throw a basic any exception if getting the symbol fails. And there we go. So now we have that documented. So now back on our buy stock service, we see all these exceptions. So now we know that this buy stock method, it could throw an insufficient funds exception, or it could throw any of these exceptions as well. Plus, since we're doing some entity framework stuff, it could throw exceptions there. But we're just going to handle those as regular exceptions as well. So they'll just go into this exception category. So now we're going to document these for the buy stock service. Let's get these exceptions in here. So we get in, let me actually import that namespace so we can get some IntelliSense right here. And this could throw an insufficient funds exception. And then this could throw an invalid symbol exception. And then just a regular exception. And that'll be thrown if the transaction fails. And there we go. So we got those documented. Let's X out of all that and go back to our buy stock command. So now, if we hover over this, we see all the exceptions that we can handle. So now let's catch those. So we're going to catch an insufficient funds exception. Let's import that. I guess I spelled it wrong. There we go. And if we get that, let's set the error message to account has insufficient funds. And then it's also a good tip when you give error messages to tell the user like what they can do to fix it. So we're going to say here, please transfer more money into your account. And we don't actually have that in the application, so this might not be the best suggestion on how to fix this, but we'll eventually add that. And the other exception we need to catch is an invalid symbol exception. And for that, we're just going to say symbol does not exist. Alright, there we go. So I really like this approach to handling error messages, by the way. I think it flows really nice just having it down here in these catch blocks. And this command looks really clean. Now one thing I do suggest doing is clearing the status message and error message before you execute any of this. Because say that this was all successful, you're going to have a stale error message in here if you had one before. So it's good to clear these before doing another operation. Alright, so let's put in another gigantic number here and attempt to buy. And there we go, we get our error message up here. So that looks really nice. And let's actually buy one. And there we go, successfully purchased. So that looks very nice. I'm pretty happy with these messages. Much better than the message boxes in my opinion. So let's go ahead and add this to other commands. So another command we have is the search symbol command. And this uses the buy view model too. So we really don't have to update much here. All we need to do is handle these exceptions. So we already have these documented as well. So for a generic exception, we can just set the view model error message to failed to get symbol information. And if it was successful, we're not going to say anything, but we have to catch this invalid symbol exception as well. So let's go ahead and do that. Invalid symbol exception. My spacing's all messed up here. And we're going to set the error message to symbol does not exist. Alright, so we're just going to put in a random symbol does not exist. Perfect. Let's go to our login command, okay? So this is going to need some work. And the issue we have here is that this login method, if we go to our authenticator, it doesn't actually throw exceptions. It just gives us back this true false flag. So we can't handle exceptions. All we could really do here in this login command is either set an error message to login failed or login successful. And that might be good for you, but I actually want to give more specific details. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this up, and I'm going to have this actually throw exceptions instead. So we can get rid of all of this, and it's actually going to throw the exceptions. So we're not handling them here, and we need to update our interface as well. And while we're here, we should document the exceptions that this could throw. Now, what could these throw? Well, our authenticator uses an authentication service, and let's see what that could throw. And that could throw a user not found exception, an invalid password exception, and then of course we're using our repository, so that could throw some kind of like entity framework exception, which we'll just say is a generic exception. Let's go ahead and document those on our authentication service. So user not found exception, and let's import that exceptions namespace so we can get some highlighting on these. So there we go, user not found exception, invalid password exception, obviously thrown if the password is invalid, and then just a regular exception is going to be thrown if the login fails. And there we go. Let's actually copy these exceptions because those are going to be used on this authenticator. So same exceptions, let's import that exceptions namespace. There we go, we get the highlighting, and that should be all the exceptions that could be thrown. So now back in our login command, we need to switch this up so this doesn't return a boolean anymore. We don't have that success flag, and we're just going to wrap this in our good old try catch. So here we go. So it's going to try and log in. If the login was successful, then it's not going to throw exceptions, and then we can re-navigate. But otherwise, let's handle these exceptions. So look at this login. Let's get that user not found exception in here. And now we can set the login view model error message, which we haven't set up yet. So let's go into our login view model, and let's get an error message view model in here. I'm actually just going to copy it from the by view model. And we're going to get this setter as well so we can just set the error message. So let's go ahead and set that. Need to make sure we instantiate that in the constructor. There we go. And then we also need that on the view too. So let's go into the login view. And I think I'm going to put this all the way at the bottom. And I'm actually just going to copy this from the by view as well. So right here. And that's another thing. We're reusing this UI. This could easily be converted into some kind of component, so we're not reusing all of this XAML. But I don't know. I don't really think it's that much to reuse. I mean, you could have a style too, but I think I'm just going to roll with what we have right now. But anyways, this is going to go in grid row 3, and then we need to add that row. And this actually has a column on it. We don't need that. This whole grid doesn't have columns, so that's okay. And what else do we need to do here? We need to import this converter. So let's get that up here. And let's just copy that from the by view. There we go. Perfect. That should work great. So let's X out of that. And now we can handle these exceptions. So for a user not found, we're going to set the error message to username does not exist. And then let's catch. What else do we need to catch? The invalid password exception, and we'll set the error message to incorrect password. That's another thing with these exceptions and handling these. You might not want to give the user this much information about whether or not their username or password was incorrect or not. You might just want to tell them login failed, and if that's the case, you could just handle these exceptions however you feel. But in this case, I feel comfortable giving this information. And then last but not least, let's handle that exception. And for this, we'll just say the login failed. Alright, so I'm going to have an invalid username. Let's log in. And username does not exist. So now, let's do a correct username, an incorrect password, incorrect password. So the last thing I want to do is actually bring in async commands. So as you can see, we're doing all these as async void, and we have all this boilerplate for our commands as well. So what I'm going to do is bring in an async command implementation, and I went over how to set this up in a video, so I suggest watching that if you're unfamiliar with async command. But I'm just going to copy that into this project. There we go. And of course, source control always in the description, so you can grab this if you don't feel like writing it out or watching the video on how to set this up. But anyways, we take care of this execute, and then we just override this execute async in our async commands. So now back in our other commands, we can just inherit from async command base, and then get rid of all this. I should actually make these read only. Let's go ahead and do that real quick. And then we don't need can execute as well. And this will now be an async task execute async that's going to override the abstract execute async. And there we go. So we get rid of some boilerplate in these commands. Let's go ahead and do that for all of these. Get rid of all that. Override async task execute async. And of course, let's bring in that base class. And same thing for the by stock command. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Task execute async. Import task and override. Anyways, I want to show off why this async command is pretty useful to use. So I'm going to search for a symbol here, and I click search, and it's searching. And as you can see, when I click that, my cursor changes, and that's because it actually disables the button. So I can't just spam it, because we use this is executing flag, and then can execute is only true if the command is not executing. So you can't just spam the button. But one thing I want to do is actually show that this button is disabled. So one thing we can do real quick is go into our styles, find our button style down here. Let's copy a trigger, and we're going to have a trigger for is enabled. And if is enabled is false, we're going to set the opacity to 0.5. And now check this out. When I search, as you can see, it grays out the button, so you can clearly see that it's not enabled. So anyways, that's where we're going to wrap things up. We went over how to display error messages and handle exceptions in MVVM commands. And then we also brought in this async command as well. So our command implementations are looking very clean. We simply execute what we need to do and then handle our errors and pass them to the view model. And real quick, I also said we should clear error messages. Let's do that right there. Okay, perfect. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave them below in the comments section. But other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.